The night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, marked one of the most devastating single attacks in the history of warfare. Operation Meetinghouse, the firebombing of Tokyo by American B-29 Superfortress bombers, killed approximately 100,000 civilians in a single night and left over 1 million people homeless. This raid, which dropped nearly 1,700 tons of incendiary bombs on the densely populated residential areas of Japan's capital, remains one of the deadliest air attacks ever conducted. The operation raises profound questions about the nature of strategic bombing, the ethics of warfare, and the terrible costs that civilian populations bear in total war. The B-29 Superfortress was the most advanced bomber of World War II, a technological marvel that represented the peak of American aviation engineering. With a wingspan of 141 feet and powered by 4 massive radial engines, the B-29 could carry enormous bomb loads over vast distances at high altitudes. The aircraft featured pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled gun turrets, and sophisticated navigation equipment. Development of the B-29 cost more than the Manhattan Project, making it one of the most expensive weapons programs of the entire war. The bomber was specifically designed for the strategic bombing campaign against Japan, capable of reaching Japanese cities from bases in the Mariana Islands after those islands were captured by American forces in 1944. The strategy behind the Tokyo firebombing represented a fundamental shift in American bombing doctrine. Earlier in the war, American bombers had attempted high-altitude precision bombing of Japanese industrial targets, similar to the daylight bombing campaign conducted over Germany. But this approach had produced disappointing results against Japan. Japanese cities were different from European cities in crucial ways. Industrial production was not concentrated in large factories that could be identified and targeted from high altitude. Instead, much Japanese war production was dispersed among thousands of small workshops, scattered throughout residential neighborhoods. Workers would manufacture components for aircraft, weapons, and other military equipment in small buildings that were indistinguishable from ordinary houses when viewed from bombing altitude. Weather conditions over Japan also made precision bombing extremely difficult. Heavy cloud cover was common, obscuring targets and making accurate bomb placement nearly impossible. High-altitude winds over Japan were far stronger than American planners had anticipated, with the jet stream creating wind speeds that could reach 200 miles per hour. These winds pushed bombs far off course and made formation flying dangerous. Bombing accuracy was poor, and losses to Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire were significant. American commanders recognized that the precision bombing approach was not working and that a different strategy was needed. General Curtis LeMay, who took command of the XX Bomber Command in January 1945, made the controversial decision to shift from precision bombing to area incendiary attacks. LeMay was a hard-driving commander who believed in the effectiveness of strategic bombing and was willing to take risks to prove it. He had commanded bombing operations in Europe and had earned a reputation for aggressive tactics and willingness to accept casualties to achieve objectives. When he arrived in the Mariana Islands and assessed the situation, LeMay concluded that the existing approach was not going to bring Japan to surrender in any reasonable time frame. He decided that if Japanese industry was dispersed throughout residential areas, then residential areas would have to be targeted. The weapon chosen for this new strategy was the M69 incendiary bomb, a 6-pound device filled with napalm, a jellied gasoline substance that burned intensely and was extremely difficult to extinguish. The M69 was designed specifically to set fire to Japanese buildings which were constructed primarily of wood and paper. Each M69 was packed into a larger cluster bomb casing that would break open at altitude, scattering the individual incendiaries across a wide area. A single B-29 could carry thousands of these small bombs, and a formation of bombers could blanket an entire neighborhood with incendiaries in a matter of minutes. LeMay's plan for the Tokyo raid was radical and risky. He ordered the B-29s to attack at night from low altitude. around 5,000 to 7,000 feet, rather than the usual 25,000 feet. This would improve bombing accuracy and allow the aircraft to carry heavier bomb loads, since they wouldn't need to climb to high altitude. To further increase the bomb load, LeMay ordered most of the defensive guns and ammunition removed from the bombers, calculating that Japanese night fighters were not effective enough to pose a serious threat. The crews were horrified by this decision, which left them nearly defenseless if attacked, but LeMay insisted the risk was acceptable. On the night of March 9, 1945, 334 B-29 bombers took off from bases on Guam, Tinian, and Saipan, heading for Tokyo. The flight took hours, with the bombers flying in streams rather than tight formations to reduce the chance of mid-air collisions in the darkness. The lead aircraft were pathfinders carrying a mix of incendiaries and high explosives to mark the target area with fires that following bombers could see and aim for. The target was a roughly rectangular area in eastern Tokyo, densely packed with wooden houses, small factories and workshops. This area contained some of the highest population densities in the world, with over 100,000 people per square mile in some neighborhoods. The attack began shortly after midnight. The Pathfinder aircraft dropped their bombs in an X pattern across the target area, creating fires that served as aiming points for the main force. Then wave after wave of B-29s flew over the burning city, dropping their incendiaries into the flames below. The M69 bombs rained down in their thousands, each one igniting on impact and spreading napalm across whatever it struck. Within minutes, hundreds of individual fires merged into larger conflagrations. Within an hour, the separate fires had combined into a massive firestorm that consumed everything in its path. A firestorm is a phenomenon where fires become so intense and widespread that they create their own weather systems. The heat rises so rapidly that it creates powerful updrafts, pulling in air from all sides at ground level. This creates winds that can reach hurricane force, feeding the fire with fresh oxygen and spreading flames to buildings that hadn't yet been hit. The temperature at the center of a firestorm can exceed 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt glass and metal. The updrafts can be so strong that they lift people and objects into the air. The smoke and heated air consume the oxygen, suffocating anyone who hasn't already been burned. A firestorm, once started, is virtually impossible to stop until it runs out of fuel. The firestorm in Tokyo on the night of March 9th created exactly these conditions. The fires merged into a massive wall of flame that advanced through the densely packed neighborhoods at terrifying speed. People who tried to flee found their escape routes cut off by fire on all sides. The heat was so intense that clothing ignited spontaneously on people hundreds of feet from the actual flames. The winds created by the firestorm were strong enough to lift burning debris and carry it ahead of the main fire, starting new blazes and trapping more people. The canals and waterways that crossed the city offered no safety, as people who jumped into them were often boiled alive as the water heated, or suffocated by the smoke and superheated air above the water's surface. The civilian population of Tokyo had no effective means of defending against this attack. Air raid shelters were inadequate, often nothing more than shallow trenches that offered no protection against the heat and flames. Firefighting equipment was primitive and overwhelmed within minutes of the attack beginning. The sheer scale of the conflagration made any organized response impossible. People could only run, trying to stay ahead of the flames, hoping to find an area that the fire hadn't yet reached. Many didn't make it. Bodies were found piled up at dead-end streets and blocked escape routes where crowds had been trapped by the advancing flames. The B-29 crews flying overhead witnessed scenes that many found deeply disturbing. The smell of burning flesh rose to the altitude where the bombers flew, entering the aircraft through ventilation systems. Pilots reported that the heat from the fires below created such powerful updrafts that their aircraft were tossed around violently, despite weighing many tons. The fires were so bright that crews could read newspapers by the light reflected into their aircraft. Some crew members were sickened, by what they were doing, realizing that they were killing enormous numbers of civilians. Others focused on the mission, believing that this terrible destruction would shorten the war and ultimately save lives by forcing Japan to surrender. By the time the last B-29 departed, and dawn broke over Tokyo, roughly 16 square miles of the city had been completely destroyed. Everything in the target area had burned to ash and rubble. Bodies lay in the streets by the thousands, many burned beyond recognition. Survivors wandered in shock through the devastation, searching for family members, finding only charred remains. The exact death toll will never be known with certainty, as many bodies were completely consumed by the fires and many victims had no family left alive to report them missing. American estimates placed the death toll at approximately 100,000, making this single raid more deadly than the initial atomic bombing of Hiroshima several months later. The strategic rationale for the Tokyo firebombing rested on several arguments. American military leaders believed that destroying Japanese cities would cripple war production, since so much manufacturing was dispersed through residential areas. They argued that the bombing would undermine Japanese morale and create pressure on the government to surrender. They pointed out that Japan had started the war with a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and had committed atrocities throughout Asia, killing millions of Chinese, Korean, Filipino, and other Asian civilians. They noted that Japanese forces had fought with fanatical determination on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, suggesting that invading the Japanese home islands would cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties. From this perspective, the firebombing, however terrible, was justified as a way to end the war more quickly and with fewer American deaths than a ground invasion would require. But these arguments, even if accepted, don't resolve the profound moral questions raised by deliberately targeting civilian populations with weapons designed to create mass casualties. The distinction between combatants and non-combatants, between military targets and civilian areas, has been considered fundamental to the laws of war for centuries. The Tokyo firebombing deliberately erased this distinction, targeting residential neighborhoods full of women, children, and elderly people who had no direct role in Japan's war effort. The M69 incendiary bomb was not a precision weapon aimed at factories or military installations. It was a weapon designed to burn down wooden houses and kill the people inside them. The campaign continued beyond the single night in Tokyo. LeMay's bombers attacked other Japanese cities using the same tactics, burning Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of smaller cities in the following months. By the summer of 1945, much of urban Japan had been reduced to ash. Millions of Japanese civilians were homeless. The death toll from the entire incendiary campaign exceeded 300,000 people. Japan's cities were systematically destroyed, one after another, in what amounted to the most extensive campaign of urban destruction in human history up to that point. The Japanese government's response to the firebombing campaign was complex. Military leaders who controlled the government were committed to fighting to the end, believing that Japan could still force a negotiated peace by making an American invasion so costly that the United States would accept something less than unconditional surrender. They were willing to sacrifice Japanese cities and civilians in pursuit of this goal. The firebombing, while devastating, did not immediately change this calculation. It took the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with the Soviet declaration of war on Japan, to finally convince Emperor Hirohito to intervene and order surrender over the objections of military leaders who wanted to continue fighting. The legacy of the Tokyo firebombing remains controversial. Some historians argue it was a necessary evil that shortened the war and saved lives overall, by making invasion unnecessary. Others contend it was a war crime, a deliberate attack on civilians that violated the laws of war and basic moral principles. The debate reflects deeper questions about what is permissible in warfare, about whether any ends can justify means that involve deliberately killing tens of thousands of non-combatants, about how we should judge actions taken in the desperate final stages of a global conflict, that had already claimed tens of millions of lives. What is beyond dispute is the human cost. 100,000 people, mostly civilians, died in a single night in Tokyo. They died terrible deaths, burned alive or suffocated in a firestorm that consumed everything in its path. Families were wiped out. Children lost parents, psychological scars for the rest of their lives. An ancient city with centuries of history and culture was largely destroyed. These facts remain, whatever judgment we pass on the strategic and moral questions surrounding the raid.